The cabin smelled of cedar and damp earth, just as Tara remembered it from her childhood. The late afternoon sun filtered through the dusty windows, casting long shadows over the shelves lined with books, tools, and old photographs. Weathered spines of leather-bound journals peeked out between carved wooden figures and bundles of dried herbs, each item a testament to her grandfather's role as keeper of traditions. Tara stood in the doorway, clutching her grandmother's key ring, feeling a pang of guilt that it had taken her grandfather's death to bring her back to the reservation. The brass keys felt cold against her palm, worn smooth by years of use. She ran her thumb over the largest one, remembering how her grandmother had always kept it polished despite its age. Now both her grandparents were gone, and the weight of their absence pressed against her chest like a physical thing. She'd been gone too long. College, work, the slow drift into adulthood. It had all pulled her farther and farther from the life she'd once known. The city had seduced her with its promises of success and advancement, each promotion and accomplishment adding another layer of distance between her and her roots. But now, standing in the doorway of her late grandfather's cabin, it was impossible to ignore how much she'd missed it, how much she'd left behind in her pursuit of what she'd thought was important. She took a deep breath and stepped inside. The floorboards creaked beneath her feet, a familiar sound that brought back memories of summer afternoons spent listening to her grandfather's stories. The air inside was thick with the scent of sage and sweet grass, mixed with the musty smell of old papers and wood smoke. Her grandfather, Henry Black Elk, had been the keeper of many stories. His voice, deep and resonant like distant thunder, had filled this cabin with tales of spirits and ancestors, of animals that walked as humans, and of the sacred objects that connected their world to the unseen. She remembered sitting cross-legged on the floor, wrapped in one of her grandmother's quilts, as he spoke of shapeshifters and spirit guides, his words painting vivid pictures in her young mind. As a child, she'd soaked up every word, believing in the magic he described with unwavering faith. But as she grew older, those stories had faded into the background, replaced by textbooks and deadlines, becoming little more than cherished childhood memories. Now, surrounded by the remnants of his life, Tara felt a strange mixture of comfort and unease. The cabin seemed smaller than she remembered, its corners darker and more angular. Shadows seemed to pool in places where it shouldn't, and the air carried a stillness that pressed against her ears like cotton wool. The familiar space felt both welcoming and somehow wrong, as if something fundamental had shifted in her absence. On the center table lay a stack of papers and a small wooden box, its surface carved with intricate patterns that seemed to move in the dim light. Tara set her bags down and approached the box, her fingers hovering over its worn surface, before finally lifting the lid. Inside was a drum, wrapped in worn animal hide, and secured with thin strips of leather that had darkened with age. She ran her fingers over its surface, marveling at the craftsmanship. Symbols were etched into the wood, circles, lines, and jagged patterns she didn't recognize, though they stirred something in her memory. The hide was soft and supple under her touch, despite its age, and seemed to warm beneath her fingers. Her grandfather's voice echoed in her memory, clear as if he were standing beside her. "This drum belongs to the spirits. Never play it unless you mean to call them." She remembered the way his eyes had hardened when he spoke those words, how his usual gentle demeanor had given way to something more severe. The spirits don't take kindly to being summoned without purpose. As a child, she had nodded solemnly, vowing never to touch it. The gravity in his voice had been enough to keep her away, even during her most curious moments. But now, standing in the cabin alone, The warning felt more like an old superstition than a true danger. The world she inhabited now was one of logic and reason, where spirits and magic belonged firmly in the realm of folklore. She lifted the drum carefully and tapped it with her fingers, producing a hollow, resonant sound that seemed to linger in the air longer than it should have. It was just a drum, she told herself, ignoring the way the temperature in the room seemed to drop at its sound. Just an old instrument, nothing more. That night, Tara couldn't sleep. The wind outside howled against the windows with an almost human voice, and the trees creaked in the darkness like old bones shifting. She lay on the cot her grandfather had always kept for guests, wrapped in a heavy wool blanket that still carried the faint scent of wood smoke. The ceiling above her seemed to writhe with shadows cast by the swaying branches outside, forming patterns that almost made sense before dissolving again into chaos. The sound of the drum still lingered in her ears, soft and rhythmic, as if it had been playing all along. She tried to convince herself it was just her imagination, her mind playing tricks in the unfamiliar darkness. But the beat seemed to grow clearer with each passing moment, taking on a life of its own. Then she heard it, a faint drumming coming from the woods. The sound was different from the echo in her mind, more substantial, more real. Tara sat up, her heart pounding against her ribs like a second drum. She held her breath, straining to listen through the whisper of wind and creak of timber. The sound was distant but unmistakable, a steady beat that seemed to rise and fall like a pulse. It carried a pattern she couldn't quite grasp, complex and ancient. She told herself it was just the wind or an animal, but the rhythm was too deliberate, too measured to be anything natural. Her hands trembling slightly, she grabbed a flashlight from her bag. The metal was cold against her palm, its weight somehow inadequate against the darkness pressing in from outside. She stepped to the window first, trying to peer into the night, but the glass only reflected her own pale face back at her, eyes wide with mounting fear. Grabbing her jacket, she stepped outside. The night was cold, the air sharp against her skin like tiny needles. The forest loomed in front of her, a wall of darkness that seemed to absorb the weak beam of her flashlight. The trees stood like silent sentinels, their branches reaching toward the star-scattered sky like grasping fingers. She hesitated on the porch, her breath forming small clouds in the frigid air, then called out, "Hello? Is someone out there?" No response, only the drumming, louder now, pulsing through the ground beneath her feet. It seemed to be coming from deep within the woods, calling to something inside her that she hadn't known existed. The rhythm matched her heartbeat, or perhaps her heart had begun to match the drum. She couldn't tell anymore. Tara's rational mind screamed at her to go back inside, to lock the door and ignore whatever was out there. The city-dwelling part of her, the part that believed in security systems and logical explanations, urged her to retreat. But something older and deeper pulled at her, a mix of curiosity and dread that felt like it came from her very bones. Her grandfather's stories whispered in her memory, tales of those who had been called by the spirits, chosen for reasons beyond human understanding. She stepped off the porch and onto the narrow trail leading into the trees. The packed earth was cold beneath her feet, each step carrying her deeper into darkness that seemed alive with movement just beyond her vision. The forest was darker than she expected, the flashlight's beam barely cutting through the thick shadows that clung to the trees like black moss. The drumming grew louder, a haunting rhythm that seemed to echo from all directions at once, making it impossible to tell where it originated. As she moved deeper, the air grew colder, carrying the musty scent of decay and something else, something ancient and wild that made the hair on the back of her neck stand up. The trees seemed to press closer together, their branches reaching for her like gnarled hands. Roots appeared to shift beneath her feet, threatening to trip her with each step. Time lost meaning in the darkness. She could have been walking for minutes or hours, guided only by the relentless drumbeat that pulled her forward. After what felt like an eternity, Tara stumbled into a clearing. The space was perfectly circular, as if carved from the forest by some massive compass. In the center stood a tall, narrow totem carved from weathered wood, its surface black with age. Symbols similar to those on the drum were etched into its surface, seeming to writhe in the flashlight's beam. The drumming stopped abruptly, leaving an eerie silence that pressed against her ears like water. Tara's breath caught in her throat as she realized the totem was surrounded by faint, glowing shapes. They flickered like candle flames in a breeze, shifting and swaying in the darkness with an otherworldly grace. She stepped closer, her pulse racing so hard she could hear it in her ears. The shapes began to take form, human figures, their features indistinct, but their presence unmistakable. They wore clothing from different eras, some in traditional dress, others in clothes from the last century, all of them transparent, yet somehow more real than anything else in the clearing. Spirits. The word formed in her mind with absolute certainty, and with it came a wave of terror so profound it made her knees weak. These were the beings her grandfather had spoken of, the ones he had treated with such careful respect. And she had summoned them, with all the casual disregard of a child playing with matches. She stumbled back, tripping over a root and falling hard to the ground. The flashlight slipped from her hand, its beam slicing through the dark like a knife. The spirits didn't move, but their glowing eyes seemed to follow her, filled with an intelligence that was decidedly inhuman. One of them raised a hand, pointing directly at her with a finger that left trails of light in the air. The drumbeat started again, louder and more frantic than before. It came from everywhere and nowhere, shaking the ground and vibrating in her chest. Tara scrambled to her feet and ran, her breath ragged and her legs shaking. The forest seemed endless, the trees closing in around her like a trap. Branches whipped at her face, leaving stinging scratches, and roots seemed to reach up to grab at her ankles. The drumming followed her, relentless and unyielding, growing louder with each step, until it filled her entire world. When Tara finally burst out of the woods and back into the clearing around the cabin, she collapsed on the porch, gasping for air. Her lungs burned with each breath, and her legs trembled with exhaustion. The drumming had stopped, but the sound echoed in her mind, a relentless rhythm she couldn't shake. Even with her eyes closed, she could still see the glowing figures. Their otherworldly presence burned into her memory. She didn't sleep that night. Instead, she sat by the fireplace, clutching a cup of tea that had long since gone cold, staring at the drum on the table. The symbols carved into its surface seemed to shift in the flickering firelight, forming patterns that made her head hurt if she looked at them too long. She wanted to believe it had all been a nightmare, a product of grief and an overactive imagination, but the ache in her legs and the scratches on her arms told her otherwise. This was real as anything she'd ever experienced. The next morning, with sunlight streaming through the windows and birds singing outside, Tara went to see Henry Two Bears, one of the elders who had been close to her grandfather. He lived in a small house at the edge of the reservation, its walls covered in traditional artwork and photographs of family gatherings. He greeted her warmly but frowned when she mentioned the drum, his weathered face growing serious. "You played it?" he asked, his tone grave. The question hung in the air between them. heavy with implications she was only beginning to understand. "I didn't think it would do anything," Tara admitted, shame coloring her voice. "It was just a drum." The words sounded hollow even to her own ears, childish in their simplicity. Henry shook his head slowly, his dark eyes filled with concern. "That drum isn't just a drum. It was used in ceremonies to call upon Waka, the spirit of retribution. Your grandfather was its keeper, and he knew its power. Playing it without purpose is a sign of disrespect." He paused, studying her face. "The spirits remember the old ways, even when we forget them." Tara's stomach twisted with guilt and fear. "I didn't mean to disrespect anything. What can I do to fix this?" The scratches on her arms seemed to burn at the memory of the previous night. Henry studied her for a long moment before speaking, his voice carrying the weight of generations. "You must make amends. The spirits won't rest until you show them you understand the weight of your actions. They have marked you now. You cannot simply walk away." He rose from his chair with deliberate slowness. "Meet me at the clearing tonight. Bring the drum. We will do what must be done." As the sun set, painting the sky in shades of blood and gold, Tara made her way back to the clearing, the drum strapped to her back. Each step felt heavier than the last, as if the forest itself was trying to slow her progress. Henry was waiting for her, a bundle of sage in his hands and a serious expression on his face. The totem seemed to watch them both, its carved surface darker than the gathering shadows. He instructed her to sit by the totem and light the sage, letting the smoke cleanse the air. The familiar scent helped calm her racing heart, though her hand still trembled as she worked. "Offer the drum to the spirits," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "and speak from your heart. Tell them why you played it and ask for forgiveness. The words matter less than the intent behind them." Tara nodded, her hands trembling as she lit the sage. The smoke curled upward in the still air, pale and ghostly in the moonlight, forming shapes that seemed almost deliberate, before dissolving into nothing. She placed the drum at the base of the totem and knelt before it, feeling the weight of unseen eyes upon her. When she spoke, her voice shook, but grew stronger with each word. "I'm sorry for playing the drum without understanding its meaning," she said, the words coming from somewhere deep inside her. "I didn't mean to disrespect the spirits or the traditions my grandfather protected. I forgot the importance of these things, but I remember now. Please forgive me." The clearing was silent for a long moment, the air growing thick with anticipation. Then the drumbeat began again, faint and rhythmic, building slowly like an approaching storm. The glowing figures appeared one by one, their forms more distinct than before, each face unique and eerily familiar. Tara's heart pounded as they circled the totem, their movements slow and deliberate, leaving trails of light in the air. One of the figures stepped forward, its form more solid than the others. It wore traditional dress, its features noble and ancient. Its hand reached out, glowing with an inner light that pulsed in time with the drum. Tara hesitated, then placed her hand in its ethereal grasp. A wave of warmth surged through her, carrying with it understanding and forgiveness, but also a warning, a reminder that the old ways still held power, that some boundaries should not be crossed without proper respect. The drumming stopped, and the figures began to fade, their forms dissolving into the night like mist. The clearing grew still, the air lighter somehow, as if a great weight had been lifted. Henry placed a hand on her shoulder, his touch grounding her in the present moment. "It is done," he said simply. "But remember this, the spirits do not forget. Honor their presence, and they will honor you in return. This is the way it has always been, and the way it must remain." Tara stayed at the cabin for another week, finishing her grandfather's affairs with a newfound respect for the stories he had told her. She sorted through his belongings with careful reverence, understanding now that each object might carry meanings beyond its physical form. The photographs and tools, the books and ceremonial items, each one was a thread in a tapestry of tradition that stretched back generations. When she finally left, she took the drum with her, understanding now that she hadn't chosen it. It had chosen her. She vowed to keep it safe and to pass on its story to those who would listen, to preserve the knowledge her grandfather had protected for so long. And sometimes, on quiet nights when the world grew still, she would hear the faintest echo of a drumbeat, reminding her of the unseen world just beyond her reach. It was no longer a sound that filled her with fear, but rather a reminder of the delicate balance between the worlds and her place in maintaining it. The drum sat in a place of honor in her home, its symbols a constant reminder of the night she learned that some things in this world are beyond simple understanding, that sometimes the old stories aren't just stories, and that wisdom doesn't always come in forms we expect to recognize. The cave mouth yawned open before Daniel, a dark void set against the red sandstone cliffs of Navajo land. He could feel the weight of its mystery pressing down on him as he adjusted his headlamp, the plastic strap digging into his sweat-dampened hair. The air here was different, heavier, as though the earth itself was holding its breath, carrying the musty scent of ancient secrets and dried sage. The warnings from the elders echoed in his mind, particularly the grave words of Sarah Begay, whose weathered face had creased with concern as she spoke of Mai's dwelling place. But he pushed them aside. Superstition had no place in archaeology, he told himself, though the thought rang hollow in the oppressive silence of the desert afternoon. The petroglyphs on the walls outside the cave were exquisite, more intricate than any he'd encountered in 15 years of fieldwork. Daniel had spent hours documenting their intricate designs, his camera clicking steadily as he captured the spirals that seemed to writhe in the shifting desert light and the unsettling depictions of Coyote, the Navajo trickster spirit. Some showed the spirit dancing among stars that appeared to pulse in the rock face. Others depicted him leading lines of people into darkness. He'd listened politely as the local guides shared their stories of Mai, how Coyote could bring both chaos and opportunity, how his gifts always carried hidden thorns. But to Daniel, these were just symbols, artifacts waiting to be understood through the lens of history, data points to be cataloged and analyzed in the comfort of his university office. "This is your shot," he muttered to himself, adjusting his pack and feeling the reassuring weight of his documentation equipment. "The discovery that puts you on the map." The words tasted bitter in his mouth, carrying an edge of desperation he preferred not to acknowledge. At 45, with tenure still eluding him, he needed something spectacular to secure his position in the field. He stepped into the cave, the temperature dropping immediately as shadow enveloped him. The first thing Daniel noticed was the silence, a presence rather than an absence. Outside, the desert wind had been constant, rustling the sagebrush and whistling through the rocks, a symphony of natural sounds that had become familiar over weeks of fieldwork. Inside, it was as if the sound had been swallowed whole, replaced by a stillness that pressed against his eardrums. The beam from his headlamp illuminated jagged walls, the surfaces glistening with moisture that shouldn't have existed in this arid region. Tiny droplets caught the light like countless watching eyes, As he ventured deeper, the petroglyphs continued, their craftsmanship becoming increasingly sophisticated. They became more elaborate, depicting Coyote in various forms, standing upright with a crown of stars, surrounded by swirling patterns that seemed to move in his peripheral vision, and finally sitting before what looked like a stone doorway etched into the cave wall itself. The figures grew more disturbing as he progressed, Coyote's form becoming more human-like, his grin wider, his eyes deeper, and more knowing. The air grew thicker with each step, carrying a metallic tang that reminded Daniel of blood. Daniel's breath caught, forming a small cloud in the unexpectedly cool air. The doorway wasn't just a carving. It was real, its edges too precise, too purposeful to be natural. His hands trembled slightly as he approached, whether from excitement or fear. He couldn't say. The stone slab fitted perfectly into the cave wall, its edges smoothed by time, yet maintaining an impossible precision. Symbols covered its surface, spirals and jagged lines, similar to those on the sacred drum he'd seen in the region's museums. But these seemed to hold a deeper purpose. They radiated outward from the center like a web, each line connecting to the next in patterns that made his eyes hurt if he tried to follow them too long. At the center of the door was an indentation, circular, and roughly the size of a human palm, worn smooth, as though countless hands had touched it before. He felt a thrill of excitement, mingled with a deeper, primal dread that he chose to ignore. This was unlike anything he'd ever encountered in his career, something that could revolutionize their understanding of prehistoric southwestern cultures. "A sealed chamber," he whispered, his voice somehow flat and dead in the dense air. "And it's mine." Continuing with the same careful expansion of each section, while maintaining the original story's integrity and atmosphere. Ignoring the warnings of the guides, their voices now distant echoes in his mind, Daniel placed his hand in the indentation. The stone was cold, colder than it should have been, and pulsed faintly beneath his fingers, like a sleeping heart. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the ground beneath him trembled, sending loose pebbles skittering across the cave floor. A low rumble filled the cave, resonating in his bones, and the slab shifted with a groan that sounded almost human, sliding to the side with impossible smoothness. Behind it was darkness, and something else. Something that made the rational part of his mind recoil, even as his academic curiosity drew him forward. At first, Daniel thought he was looking at another set of petroglyphs, but as he shone his headlamp deeper into the chamber, the figures on the walls seemed to shimmer and move, dancing in ways that defied the play of light and shadow. His skin prickled, every hair standing on end as though the air was charged with static electricity. The air was heavier here, tinged with a strange metallic scent that reminded him of thunderstorms and fresh blood. "Welcome," a voice said, smooth as wind-polished stone. Daniel froze, his muscles locking in primitive fear. The voice was low and smooth, but it carried an edge that made the hairs on his neck stand up, a timbre that spoke of ancient things and hungry shadows. He swung his light around but saw no one, the beam seeming to bend and distort in the thick air. "Who's there?" he demanded, his voice echoing back to him in mocking fragments. His hand instinctively reached for the satellite phone in his pocket, though he already knew it would find no signal this deep underground. "You opened the door," the voice continued, ignoring his question. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, as though the very walls were speaking. "Do you know what you seek?" Daniel's pulse quickened, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. Sweat trickled down his spine despite the chamber's chill. "Knowledge," he said cautiously, falling back on the familiar language of academia. I'm an archaeologist. I study history. The voice chuckled, a sound like dry leaves rustling in the wind, like old bones shifting in ancient graves. History is a story, written by those who survive to tell it, and every story has its price. Something moved at the edge of his light, a darkness deeper than shadow. A figure emerged, tall and lean, its form shifting like smoke in the wind, never quite settling into a fixed shape. Its face was sharp, with a long, pointed nose and eyes that gleamed with cunning, eyes that held galaxies of ancient wisdom and malicious mirth. It was unmistakably Coyote, the trickster spirit made manifest, though seeing him violated everything Daniel believed about reality. "You've done well to find this place," Coyote said, his voice carrying a note of amusement that made Daniel's stomach churn. "Few dare to seek me out. Fewer still have the courage to open the door. But tell me, what will you give in exchange for what you desire?" Daniel felt a flicker of unease blossom into full-blown fear, but forced it down beneath layers of academic detachment. This was the moment he'd been waiting for, a discovery that could change everything, that could secure his place in history. "I don't understand." "What do you want?" Coyote grinned, his teeth sharp and too many, gleaming like polished obsidian in the beam of Daniel's headlamp. "That depends. What do you value most? Your mind? Your memories? Your dreams? Everything has a price, and I am quite skilled at finding exactly what each seeker can least afford to lose." In the days that followed, Daniel's life began to change in subtle ways that grew increasingly impossible to ignore. After returning from the cave, he threw himself into his research with feverish intensity, documenting every detail of his discovery. His hands shook as he sketched the symbols from memory, each line seeming to writhe on the page. The stone doorway, the enigmatic symbols, the encounter with Coyote. It all became the foundation of a paper that quickly gained attention in academic circles. Invitations to speak at conferences poured in, and his name was featured in prominent journals. His colleagues spoke of paradigm shifts and groundbreaking discoveries. At first, it felt like success, like vindication of his life's work. But then, the cracks began to show, hairline fractures in reality that widened with each passing day. Unseasonable storms battered the region with unprecedented fury, destroying crops and flooding homes. The rain fell in patterns that seemed almost deliberate, forming symbols on the ground that matched those in the cave. Wildlife behaved erratically, with reports of animals turning aggressive or vanishing altogether. Coyotes appeared in impossible places, on rooftops, in locked cars, inside sealed buildings, their eyes gleaming with familiar intelligence. Daniel dismissed these events as coincidences, the natural ebb and flow of nature. But each morning brought new disturbances that became increasingly difficult to rationalize. But the Navajo elders weren't so quick to ignore the signs, their worried whispers spreading through the community like smoke. "You disturbed the balance," said Thomas Yazzie, one of the elders, when Daniel visited him seeking answers. The old man's face was lined with worry as he tended a small fire, its smoke carrying the sweet scent of sage and cedar. "Coyote thrives on chaos. By making a bargain with him, you invited that chaos into our world. The boundary between worlds has grown thin." "I didn't make a bargain," Daniel protested, though the words felt hollow even as he spoke them. His dreams had been filled with echoes of that conversation in the cave, fragments that slipped away like water when he tried to grasp them. Thomas shook his head, his dark eyes reflecting the firelight. "You opened the door. That alone was enough. Some doors are meant to stay closed. Some knowledge is meant to remain hidden. The ancestors knew this. The chaos wasn't limited to the natural world. Daniel's personal life began to unravel like a sweater caught on a nail. Friends and colleagues turned distant, their once friendly conversations laced with mistrust and unease. He caught them whispering when they thought he couldn't hear, saw how they avoided meeting his eyes. Equipment failed inexplicably during his fieldwork. Cameras capturing only static and shadow. Recording devices playing back voices that hadn't been there during recording. His research assistants quit without explanation, leaving behind notes that made reference to dreams they refused to describe. At night, he dreamed of the cave, of Coyote's grinning face and the shimmering figures on the walls. In these dreams, the symbols moved and shifted, spelling out truths he couldn't remember upon waking. He would jerk awake in cold sweats, his sheets tangled around him, the taste of dust and ancient stone in his mouth. One evening, as he reviewed his notes for the 100th time, searching for some detail he might have missed, the lights in his apartment flickered and went out. In the darkness, he heard the familiar chuckle, a sound that had haunted the edges of his consciousness for weeks. "You've done well for yourself," Coyote's voice said, smooth and mocking, seeming to come from everywhere at once. "But tell me, how do you enjoy the price of your success?" Daniel spun around, his heart racing, the sound of his pulse drowning out all other noise. Coyote stood in the corner, his form half hidden in shadow, but his eyes gleamed with the same ancient malice they had held in the cave. "What do you want from me?" Daniel demanded, his voice cracking. The temperature in the room had dropped, his breath visible in the dim light filtering through the windows. Coyote tilted his head, the movement too fluid to be natural. "I gave you what you wanted. Knowledge, recognition, power. The door to understanding was opened, just as you desired. But balance must be restored. The question is, are you willing to pay the price? Or shall I continue to collect it in my own way?" Desperate to undo the damage, Daniel returned to the cave, though every instinct screamed at him to run in the opposite direction. The storms had made the path treacherous, washing away parts of the trail and leaving behind mud that sucked at his boots like hungry mouths. But he pressed on, the weight of his mistakes driving him forward. When he reached the stone doorway, it was already open. The chamber beyond bathed in an eerie glow that pulsed like a living heart. Coyote was waiting for him, as Daniel had known he would be. "Back so soon?" he said, his grin widening impossibly, splitting his face like a crack in the earth. "Have you come to make another bargain? Perhaps this time we could trade for something more substantial?" Daniel clenched his fists, feeling the bite of his nails against his palms. "I want to fix this. Tell me how. Please." The last word came out as a whisper, a prayer, a surrender. Coyote's eyes gleamed with ancient fire. "Ah, but that would require sacrifice. Are you prepared to give up what you hold most dear? Your achievements, your discoveries, the recognition you've craved for so long?" Daniel hesitated, the weight of the choice pressing down on him like stone. The thought of losing his career, his reputation, everything he'd worked for, filled him with a dread that threatened to overwhelm him. But the images of flooded homes, frightened villagers, and dying animals weighed heavier. The balance had to be restored. "What do I have to do?" he asked, his voice steady despite his fear. Coyote's grin faltered, replaced by a look of unsettling seriousness that was somehow more terrifying than his usual mirth. "Restore what was taken, close the door, and seal it with your blood. Only then will the balance be restored." But know this, what is given up can never be reclaimed. The ritual was simple, but harrowing, each moment charged with supernatural weight. Coyote instructed Daniel to place his hand on the stone slab and carve the symbols into the surface using a knife that appeared in the trickster's hand, its blade dark and ancient. As Daniel worked, his hands steady despite the pain, the air around him grew heavier, the chamber filled with a low, resonant hum that seemed to come from the earth itself. When the final symbol was complete, carved in lines of blood and shadow, Coyote stepped back, his form shimmering like heat waves over desert sand. Now seal it. Complete what you began. Daniel pressed his hand against the symbols, feeling the blade bite into his palm. Blood seeped into the carvings, and the door began to tremble beneath his touch. The glowing figures on the walls shimmered and dissolved, their whispers fading into silence, taking with them all record of his discoveries. As the stone slab slid back into place with the finality of a tomb being sealed, the air in the chamber grew still. For the first time in weeks, Daniel felt a sense of peace, though it was tinged with the bitterness of loss. "You've done well," Coyote said, his voice softer now, almost gentle. "But remember, balance is fragile. Do not disturb it again. Some doors are meant to remain closed. Some knowledge is meant to stay buried." And with that, he vanished, leaving behind only the scent of sage and stone. In the weeks that followed, the storm subsided, and the land began to heal. The wildlife returned to normal, and the strange occurrences ceased. Daniel withdrew from the public eye, his groundbreaking paper mysteriously lost in academic circles, his discoveries fading like dreams in morning light. He focused instead on repairing his relationships with the Navajo community, learning to listen rather than merely document. He shared what he'd learned, not as a tale of conquest, but as a cautionary story about respect, balance, and the cost of ambition. His colleagues eventually forgot about his brief moment of fame, their memories of his discoveries growing hazy and uncertain. But the local people remembered, and they watched him with knowing eyes as he worked to make amends. And though he would never forget Coyote's grin, the shape of it etched into his nightmares, he vowed to tread carefully in the spaces between worlds, knowing the trickster's bargains always came at a price, one that continued to whisper to him in the dark of night, reminding him of doors best left unopened and knowledge best left unclaimed. The snowstorm had come early that year, blanketing the northern Minnesota wilderness in a thick, suffocating silence that seemed to swallow every sound except the hollow whisper of wind through bare branches. Caleb Foster, a seasoned park ranger of 15 years, tightened his scarf against the biting cold and adjusted his flashlight as he trudged through the frozen forest, his boots leaving deep impressions in the virgin snow. The powerful beam of light cut through the relentless flurry of snowflakes, illuminating the trail ahead like a lighthouse beam piercing through fog. His breath came in visible puffs, crystallizing instantly in the frigid air. Somewhere in this desolate expanse was the answer to the strange reports he'd been receiving for weeks. Mutilated deer carcasses with bones picked impossibly clean, claw marks gouged unnaturally deep in ancient trees, and most troubling of all, the sudden disappearance of a pair of hikers, experienced backpackers who should have known better than to venture this deep into the wilderness during the onset of winter. Caleb had seen his share of predators and harsh winters in his years patrolling these woods. He'd tracked wolf packs, faced down aggressive bears, and weathered storms that had buried his cabin up to its windows. But something about these incidents unsettled him on a primal level, stirring ancient instincts that whispered of dangers best left unnamed. The claw marks didn't match any known animal in the region. Too wide, too deep, and spaced in a pattern that suggested a creature that shouldn't exist. And the way the carcasses were left, stripped of meat with surgical precision, yet bearing deep, jagged gashes that spoke of savage fury, felt fundamentally wrong. As if they were messages written in a language of violence he didn't want to understand. Accompanying him was Marie Whitefeather, an elder from the nearby Ojibwe reservation, whose weathered face bore the quiet dignity of one who had spent a lifetime reading the secrets of these forests. Her silver hair was bound in a traditional braid that hung down her back, partially hidden beneath a worn wool cap. She had insisted on joining him after hearing about the strange occurrences, her request carrying the weight of generations of wisdom. "The forest isn't safe," she had warned him 3 days ago, standing in his office, with her dark eyes unwavering, like pools of ancient knowledge. "Not when the Wendigo is near. The signs are clear to those who know how to read them." Caleb had dismissed her words at first, chalking them up to folklore and superstition, the kind of stories that seemed to multiply in isolated communities during the long, dark winters. But as the reports piled up, and the evidence grew more disturbing, her presence began to feel like a necessity, rather than a concession to local customs. There was something reassuring about having her beside him, as if she carried with her some ancient shield against the darkness that seemed to be gathering in these woods. "We're close," Marie said, her voice barely audible over the wind's mournful keening. She carried a small bundle of sage, carefully tied with red twine, and a copper bowl filled with sacred ash, items whose significance Caleb didn't fully understand, but had learned not to question. "Do you feel it? The way the air grows thick with malice?" Caleb didn't answer immediately, taking time to process the sensations that had been growing stronger as they ventured deeper into the forest. There was a heaviness in the air, a suffocating weight that pressed against his chest like a physical presence. It was the kind of unease he'd felt before major storms, or in the presence of a predator stalking its prey, but magnified to an almost unbearable degree. The very atmosphere seemed charged with malevolent intent. "Yeah," he said finally, his words forming clouds in the frozen air. "I feel it, like something's watching us." They reached the site of the latest incident, a clearing where another deer carcass had been found by a terrified cross-country skier the previous morning. Caleb swept his flashlight over the area, noting the familiar signs that had become a grotesque signature. Claw marks scoring the nearby trees so deeply they exposed the pale flesh beneath the bark. Deep gouges in the frozen earth that no natural creature could have made, and the scattered remains of the animal arranged in a way that seemed almost ritualistic. The snow was disturbed in a wide radius, as though something massive had dragged itself through the clearing in a frenzied dance of violence. "It's hunting," Marie said, kneeling to examine the tracks with the careful attention of a forensic investigator. Her gloved fingers traced the edge of one enormous impression in the snow, her expression grave. "And it's hungry. The hunger never leaves it. It only grows stronger with each passing day." Caleb frowned, his professional skepticism warring with the evidence before his eyes. "What exactly are we dealing with here? A bear? A wolf pack? Something that escaped from a private collection, maybe?" Marie shook her head slowly, her expression pitying, as if he were a child trying to rationalize away the monster under his bed. "No animal leaves marks like these, Caleb. And no animal carries the spirit of greed and hunger, like the Wendigo. This is something older than your science, something that was here long before your ancestors crossed the ocean." He sighed, suppressing his frustration, even as a shiver ran down his spine that had nothing to do with the cold. I respect your beliefs, Marie, but I need something concrete, something I can put in a report that won't get me laughed out of the service. Then keep your eyes open, she said, standing with a grace that belied her age. Her dark eyes seemed to reflect something ancient and terrible, because the Wendigo won't give you time to doubt when it decides to show itself. Belief isn't required for survival. As the hours passed, the storm intensified, transforming the forest into a swirling maelstrom of white. Caleb and Marie continued their patrol, the snow crunching underfoot like broken bones and the wind howling like a wounded animal, or something trying to imitate one. Caleb's radio crackled sporadically, its signal growing weaker as they ventured deeper into the remote wilderness. He thought about calling for backup, but hesitated, his thumb hovering over the transmit button. What would he even tell them? That he was tracking a mythological creature through a blizzard with an elderly tribal woman? That something impossible was hunting in these woods? Marie walked ahead, her movements deliberate and purposeful, as though she were following a path only she could see through the storm. Her figure seemed to waver and blur in the swirling snow, sometimes appearing to elongate in ways that made Caleb's eyes hurt. He followed closely, his hand resting on the grip of his rifle, though a voice in the back of his mind wondered what good modern weapons would be against something that seemed to step straight out of ancient nightmare. The unease in his chest had grown sharper, like a splinter lodged deep in his ribcage, sending tendrils of pain through his body with each breath. "Wait," Marie said suddenly, holding up a hand, her body tensing like a bowstring pulled taut. Caleb stopped, his boots skidding slightly on the snow-covered ground. "What is it?" She pointed to a cluster of trees ahead, her hand steady despite the biting cold. Caleb squinted, his flashlight struggling to pierce the curtain of swirling snow. At first he saw nothing unusual in the darkness between the trunks. Then, he noticed the shadows, shapes that didn't belong, shifting and swaying with an unnatural fluidity that made his stomach lurch. They seemed to move independent of the wind, following patterns that defied natural law. "Stay here," he said, raising his rifle and trying to ignore the tremor in his hands. The weapon's familiar weight offered little comfort against the growing certainty that they were facing something beyond its power to stop. "No," Marie said sharply, grabbing his arm with surprising strength. Her eyes blazed with intensity. "It's already seen us. Splitting up will only make it easier for it to take you. That's how it works. It separates its prey, isolates them until the hunger and fear drive them mad." Caleb hesitated, years of training warring with instincts that screamed for him to run. Finally, he nodded, accepting that they were beyond the realm where standard procedures held any meaning. Together they moved toward the shadows, their steps slow and deliberate. The snow seemed to absorb the sound of their movements, like a hungry mouth, leaving only the howling wind and the faint crunch of their boots to mark their passage. As they neared the trees, Caleb's flashlight illuminated a shape that made his mind recoil in horror. It was humanoid, but grotesquely elongated, its limbs too long and too jointed, its body emaciated beyond anything that could sustain life. Its skin was pale as moonlight and stretched tight over its bones like parchment, decorated with patterns of frost that seemed to shift and change as it moved. But it was the eyes that drew his attention and held it, sunken pits of absolute darkness that seemed to glow with an inner light, the color of starvation. They fixed on him with an intelligence that was terrifyingly human, filled with a hunger that went beyond mere physical need. The creature let out a low, guttural growl that seemed to bypass his ears and vibrate directly in his bones. And Caleb felt his blood run cold as ancient instincts screamed in recognition of a predator that had haunted humanity's darkest dreams since the first hunters gathered around fires to ward off the night. Wendigo, Marie whispered, the word carrying the weight of centuries of terror. The creature moved with unnatural speed, its body flowing between the trees like smoke given form. Caleb fired a shot, the rapport thundering through the forest. But the Wendigo was already gone, leaving only a lingering echo of its presence, a cold spot in the air that seemed to radiate malevolence. Caleb cursed under his breath, his hands trembling as he reloaded, knowing in his heart that bullets might as well be raindrops against something so ancient and terrible. "We need to leave," he said, his voice tight with controlled panic. "Now." "You can't outrun it," Marie said with the calm certainty of one who had always known this moment would come. "Not unless you face it. Running only feeds its hunger. It will chase you until exhaustion and fear break down your will to resist." "Face it? Are you kidding me? Did you see that thing?" Marie ignored his protests, pulling the sage bundle from her pocket with steady hands. She lit it with a match, the fragrant smoke curling into the frigid air like prayers made visible. "The Wendigo isn't just a creature," she said, her voice taking on a rhythmic quality that seemed to push back against the howling wind. "It's a spirit, born of greed and hunger. It infects those who are weak, who give in to their darkest impulses. It is the shadow that lives in every human heart, given form by desperation and desire." Caleb wanted to argue, to dismiss her words as superstition, but the image of the creature lingered in his mind like a brand. There was nothing natural about it, nothing he could explain away with science or reason. It was an offense against nature itself, a walking embodiment of hunger that could never be satisfied. "What do we do?" he asked, finally accepting that they had stepped into a world where his training and experience meant nothing. "We hold our ground," Marie said, her voice carrying the strength of generations who had faced this terror before. "And we remind it that it has no power over us unless we give it permission to enter our hearts." The Wendigo returned minutes later, its guttural growl announcing its presence like a perversion of human speech. Caleb raised his rifle, but Marie stepped forward, holding the burning sage and the copper bowl filled with ash. She began to chant, her voice steady and firm, despite the wind and snow, speaking words in a language that seemed to make the air itself vibrate with power. The creature hesitated, its movements becoming jerky and uncertain, like a marionette whose strings had become tangled. Caleb took aim, but Marie placed a hand on his arm, her touch burning with unexpected warmth. "Not yet," she said, never breaking the rhythm of her chant. "The bullet must find more than flesh. It must strike at the moment when spirit and body are most vulnerable." The chanting grew louder, the words foreign, yet rhythmic, seeming to draw power from the very earth beneath their feet. The Wendigo let out a shriek that sent shards of ice falling from the trees, its body contorting as it tried to move closer. Caleb could feel the air vibrating around him, the weight of the spirit's presence pressing against his chest like a physical force. The creature's form seemed to flicker between solid and shadow, as if it were being pulled between two worlds. "Now," Marie said, stepping aside with fluid grace. Caleb fired. The bullet struck the Wendigo in the chest, and it let out a piercing wail that contained all the hunger and loneliness of endless winter nights. The creature collapsed to the ground, its body writhing in the snow before finally going still. The forest fell silent, the snow settling softly around them like ash from a funeral pyre. In the aftermath, Caleb and Marie stood in the clearing, their breaths visible in the cold air that seemed somehow cleaner, lighter. The Wendigo's body had begun to dissolve, its form breaking apart like ash in the wind. leaving behind only a dark stain in the snow and the lingering scent of ancient ice. Is it over?